We here at Taboo Education have always been of the assumption that if you're watching our videos, then you've probably been watching Caitlin Doughty's videos on the Ask a Mortician channel for years now. So many of you are probably aware that her and the mainstream funeral industry aren't exactly best buds. But we wanted to know how she is perceived outside of her home country of the US, and to explain why the perception is so divided, which has led to the longest research period of my life since my last master's thesis. So please don't let our hard work go to waste. Please give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk. Who is Caitlin Doughty and what the US and international funeral industry think of her? Let's begin with who Caitlin Doughty is so that we're all up to speed. In a nutshell, she started the whole death positivity movement. And as a side note, I know we don't use that phrase death positivity on here. We do morally and ethically align ourselves with that, but we choose to use the term death acceptance for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we'll do a video on in the future. Now, Ms Doughty was born in Hawaii in 1984, making her 39 now. However, she started making YouTube videos in 2011 when she would have been 27. And keep this fact in mind as we'll come back to it in a bit. In these videos, she aims to help the public become more accepting of death as natural and normal. In 2011, she founded the funeral reform collective, the Order of the Good Death, which has initiated the death positive movement. She is a certified mortician and until very recently co-owned a funeral home in LA since 2015, which emphasized giving families a more hands-on approach when dealing with their deceased loved ones, as well as a more green approach in general. In more recent years, her advocacy work has moved more towards alternative methods of body disposal, including petitioning states in the US for the legalization of human composting. And if you're not sure what that is, we have a link in our description to our video all about it. Further, Ms Doughty has authored 3 books over the years. The Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, published in 2014, which is a bit autobiographical. From Here to Eternity, which is about death rituals around the world, published in 2017. And Will the Cat Eat My Eyeballs, which personally is my favourite title ever, which answered death questions raised by kids and published in 2019. So quite a busy lady, I think you will agree. But advocating for change, particularly legal change, doesn't come without complications and enemies. And Ms Doughty has had her share of both, which she has spoken about openly, including in a video posted on the Ask a Mortician YouTube channel in 2016 titled Fighting with Other Funeral Directors, in which she explains her thoughts and feelings on the matter. And I'll post a link to that in the description below. So now we're all on the same page, let's look at the results of the survey. Before we get started here, I want to make it clear that the information and statistics that follow were not found through random Google searches. We have spent the last 7 months making phone calls, Zoom calls and emails successfully to 542 funeral company owners and personnel around the world, along with supplementary research to go along with it. Now 542 is still just a drop in the ocean compared to how many funeral employees exist, but I think you can agree it's still a chunky number. We made sure to include companies from the USA, Canada, UK, Germany, Singapore, Australia and New Zealand. We looked at urban and rural-based companies, long-standing and recently developed companies, independent and chain companies. We wanted a well-rounded survey, which is why it took us so damn long to make this video. Now with that cravat out of the way, onwards to the USA. It is no secret that some in the US funeral industry do not like Ms Doughty. Mention her name in an online forum or on social media and there will be just as many individuals willing to express their disdain for her as those that praise her. From the 208 individuals from the US industry that we surveyed, 108 were for her, 84 against, and 16 had no idea who she was. There is no question that a small but vocal group do not like her for various reasons, but it is just that, a small minority. So keep that in mind as we look at the reasons given. One of the biggest arguments against her is that she is against embalming. In fact, of the 84 US funeral employees who disliked her, 77 mentioned that specifically. Many said that she's not an embalmer, implying that if it's not your job, you shouldn't be making comment. They said she didn't talk about the positives of embalming and how it's an art form. Now, during our 7 months of research, we re-watched every single one of her videos on the Ask a Mortician channel, being on the lookout for her stances on every possible topic. And here's the thing, not once did she say that embalmers were bad or that embalming should disappear completely. She said that its use should be lessened, particularly on those corpses where it's not needed, and that is very different. During this surveying, we did politely mention that the USA is in the minority of countries that use embalming as standard, to which the response was usually something along the lines of, "We respect the dead in this country," making a very obvious implication, I think you will agree. For all of us outside the US, it may seem odd that these individuals hold so tightly onto this belief when the rest of the world doesn't. So let's remember that embalming as we know it today grew out of the US Civil War and became a big money spinner then and continues to this day. But the attitude of embalming is the right thing to do has also been repeated over and over from that generation of the Civil War. Almost a mantra, and now no one really remembers why or that much has changed since the Civil War. And because of this mantra being repeated over and over through the generations, that is now their norm, even though statistics around the world say otherwise. This is not to say that they are wrong to continue embalming those who want to be embalmed. Of course not. You have the right to do with your body as you wish, providing it's legal, of course. But to hate on someone suggesting another option is implying that you don't want others to have the right to do with their body as they please, and that is not okay. Another argument that was repeated was she's an entertainer and she spreads misinformation to get views. But let's look at the entertainer statement first. This was seen as both a positive and negative in the whole of our survey. Those who liked and supported her work agreed that she was entertaining, that in order to get people to listen, you need to be entertaining. Boring people don't get listened to. And it is her being entertaining that leads people to say she is spreading misinformation. Though the majority who said that couldn't or wouldn't clarify what that was exactly. And without them clarifying, we couldn't work out if they had legitimate standing here or misinformation was actually code for we just don't like what she's saying. Now, this was very frustrating as I genuinely wanted to know what this misinformation was. Now, for those of you outside the US who suddenly start twitching when a US person says someone is spreading misinformation, yeah, your instincts would be correct in this case. So let me tell you, because I'm not stupid and whatever you put on the internet is forever, we looked at all survey participants' public information, websites, social media, and so on. And of the 84 people who professed their hate for Ms Doughty, 81 were staunch Republicans with, shall we say, stereotypical right-wing views, and most resided within the Bible Belt, as they colloquially name the region. Now, before you accuse me of having a go at these people, I bring this up for good reason. Ms Doughty, especially when she started her YouTube channel, was young, female, alternative-looking, liberal, and living in California. All 5 of those things are the opposite of those who strongly oppose her, who our survey tells us is mostly old, male, straight-laced, conservative, and in the deep south. Anyone under 30 can understand what it's like to walk into a new professional job, and because you have a fresh set of eyes on the situation, you can quickly see that your boss is very stuck in his old ways. And you know the backlash you get if you try to change his mind. Many women will know what it's like to work in a male-dominated profession where they're not taken seriously. And those with even the slightest alternative look will know the assumptions that you get in a professional workplace. These are all reasons for these people to immediately dislike her before she even opens her mouth. But when she has the audacity to get popular for pointing out flaws in the system, that's when that dislike turns to hate. And wow, did I come across some of that. So let's talk about it. Of the 84 US individuals who responded negatively, I'd say half of them were perfectly civil human beings. They understood that we were conducting research, they were able to calmly and politely construct sentences to explain their points of view, they were pleasant and professional. About a quarter were clearly miffed when we mentioned her name, but with some gentle encouragement were able to define the specific points that they disliked. Then there was the other quarter, who had such a visceral response to simply being asked if they'd ever heard of Ms Doughty's name that it made me incredibly uncomfortable. Again, I repeat, this was a very, very small percentage. But the vile language they used, the physical signs of anger they exhibited, and their inability to form coherent sentences because of said anger was highly disturbing. And no, we didn't provoke them. We had 2 questions. Do you know who Ms Doughty is? And if yes, What are your thoughts on her and her work? That's it. And these calls were conducted by prior appointment during work hours when they were on their work premises at time when they were supposed to be showing professionalism. Now, if it was me personally, I'd be giving the police a heads up and installing more security cameras. The thing that my logical brain can't comprehend about these kinds of people is their lack of social awareness. They are so consumed with hate for one individual's opinion who they've never met that they fail to realise that that person's opinions and advocacy, in reality, is not going to affect them. This kind of advocacy doesn't turn people off embalming and traditional funerals if that's not what they want. If potential clients, such as those in the Bible Belt, are 100% committed to embalming and traditional burial, they won't change their minds. So these rage-filled individuals are getting upset over nothing because it won't affect them financially and it won't affect their community personally. It is the people who are on the fence about the issue whose minds may be swayed, but the fact that they are so illogical would certainly make me feel uneasy. As an Australian, that kind of hate, borderline extremist views is not something I commonly come across, especially in a professional setting. And I'm not going to lie, after finishing up some of these calls, I was so on edge I didn't sleep those nights. Okay, so that's where the against and extremely against sit on the topic of Ms Doughty. It's the difference in opinion about embalming, who a funeral director should be, industry reputation, and the perceived threat to their finances. Again, a reminder that while they are loud, they are definitely in the minority. But what about those for her in the industry? What did they have to say? Many credit her as the reason they went into the industry in the first place, and these included funeral directors, embalmers, and other funeral staff. As you would assume, these individuals are mostly in their 20s and 30s. Some went into training straight out of school, and for some it was a career change. When we look at those of an older generation, many praised her for the information she gave and for taking the initiative in starting her YouTube channel and in her advocacy work. Many admit that they hadn't had much of an idea about what was even possible for future body disposal methods, and they feel younger funeral workers like herself have really opened up some new doors. Speaking of the older generation, as we said earlier, the funeral industry stereotypically has been run by antiquated old men, often to its detriment. However, I also had the pleasure of speaking to a number of older gentlemen in the industry who thought that Ms Doughty was a gift. Many said as funeral workers, they often feel forgotten and unappreciative, but her work made the public more aware of their relevance in society. Others said that she made them more aware of some of their old-fashioned biases and that they've made efforts to change their thinking. One chap in his 80s, who was still working in the industry by the way, said that his niece introduced him to Ms Doughty's YouTube channel while he was on bed rest with a broken hip. He said he watched every video and felt such a sense of pride that fresh young people were entering his industry and updating it as necessary. We had a great chat and he had some great stories to tell, which reminds me, go spend some time talking to the older generation, eh? Now let's head internationally. So outside of the US, we surveyed 334 funeral professionals from Canada, UK, Germany, Singapore, Australia and New Zealand. Once again, these individuals were chosen randomly, but we made sure to contact funeral homes that were both urban and rurally located, old and new. And of that said 334, 295 had a positive view of Ms Doughty and her work, 155 were against, and 92 had no idea who she was. Interestingly, only 6 of the 155 funeral employees against her mentioned anything about them feeling that her advocacy impacts their bottom dollar negatively. And they were all from Canada. In fact, aside from a handful just saying that they found her presentation style annoying, most of the 155 opposed to her work were because of the embalming issue or that they felt that she was putting the funeral industry in a bad light. To elaborate, those who felt she portrayed embalmers in a bad light were almost always Canadian and a couple from the UK. This makes sense statistically, as the USA and Canada are the only 2 countries in the world where embalming is seen as standard practice according to the Funeral Consumer Alliance. However, unlike in the US, where it was embalmers and funeral directors against her for her perceived bias against embalming, those against her for this reason in Canada and the UK were only embalmers, i.e. embalming was the whole of their career, meaning they see it as a slight against their reputation, not their bottom dollar. The other issue those had against her was that they felt she was putting the funeral industry in a bad light, but there is also an interesting tangent to this. Of the 155 against her outside the US, 149 said that she put them in a bad light, stating they believe she made all funeral workers out to be money-hungry scam artists, the kind of slimy people who manipulate the vulnerable. The interesting thing, though, was that every single one of them who said this also said they wouldn't care if she was so popular and saying what she said if it was more bluntly stated to the audience that she was specifically talking about the US funeral industry. And to be completely honest, yeah, I understand that, and it's one of the reasons we created this channel. Many of them pointed out that while licensing is very tight in the US, regulation is not, which is almost the complete opposite to many countries like Australia, which is why we don't have the big scandals like those seen on Ms Dougherty's channel. Others pointed out that because of the influx of American culture, many people outside the US think that their countries have embalming as standard, and have then gone on to see Ms Doughty advocating so passionately for less of it, not always realising she's speaking about the US, and then end up in tears at the funeral home when their parent dies, thinking that they'll be embalmed without them knowing. My impression of those against her outside the US was that they were tired of Americanized influence. They weren't angry at her like some of the US participants were, and they certainly didn't hate her or her work. They were just tired of dealing with yet another American voice in their country and it breeding fear and mistrust amongst their clients. But now let's look at the vast majority. We should mention here that within the US participants, only 7.6% had never heard of Ms Doughty, whereas 22.7% of participants outside the US hadn't heard of her. And keep in mind that percentage would certainly increase had we surveyed non-English speaking countries. But the overwhelming majority had heard of her and felt positively. Again, a sizable amount said that it was Ms Dougherty's YouTube channel that encouraged them to go into the industry. And along this line, there were older generations of funeral workers saying how pleased they were with the fresh blood coming through the industry. But the notable thing about these participants outside the US was that they had a lot less focus on her YouTube channel and more on her advocating for alternative body disposal methods. Those in Singapore were very interested about these new methods, which makes sense considering their current cemetery crisis, which we are doing a video on very soon. Many said that while her advocacy wasn't going to make much of a difference in their country, they were thrilled to see someone, especially someone so young, making such a positive difference. And I can't tell you how many times I heard, I wouldn't even have a clue where to start. I should point out that that is not to say that advocacy for alternative body disposal methods isn't happening in these countries. On the contrary, it's happening a lot. It's just not being directly pushed by funeral workers like it is in the US. They are on board, they're just not leading it. The Australian funeral industry, like many countries' industries around the world, is run quite differently than the US industry. The problem is that so much of the information that we receive on a day-to-day basis for almost anything comes from a US perspective. Social media, TV, Hollywood bombard us with information not pertinent to our country's industry. And it gets into our minds. We try to filter it out, but many Australians still think their bodies are embalmed over here because they hear it so often coming from TV and US news, and that's just not the case. And it's why advocates for change to our industry are different here. Ms Doughty is taking on a much more stubbornly routed industry than ours ever was, and hence she's getting more hate for it. And don't get me wrong, we have our advocates here too advocating for green body disposal methods mainly, but they don't receive the same amount of hate as someone like Ms Doughty does. It appears those against her in the US feel like she's trying to take something from them, rather than adding an alternative, which is how our advocates are generally seen here. Maybe it's a cultural thing in the US, and this is how they choose to understand significant issues, making it black or white, with no grey whatsoever being allowed to exist. But love her or hate her, you've got to admit it takes guts to do what she's done, especially in such a public way. And with that, what are your thoughts on all of this? Let us know in the comments. And now, go talk death.